So the nervous system. The nervous system is enormous. It contains billions and billions of cells. It's very complicated. So a question that sometimes arises is, how do we even begin to address it? Well, first let's think a little bit about the various components of the nervous system. There is, of course, the brain. Right here's the brain. It fits in like this. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. Your eyeballs sit right underneath these giant chunks called lobes, frontal lobes right here. The brain actually consists of this big, kind of wrinkled mass here at the top, which everybody thinks of when they think of the brain. This is called the cerebrum, actually. And then back here is this structure. These, everything is very symmetrical in the brain, but these two pieces here, these form the cerebellum, which, it looks much smaller, as a component of the brain versus the cerebrum. However, most of the brain cells that you've got in your head are actually found in the cerebellum. About 69 billion cells, neurons anyway, are found in this structure versus about 86 billion, for the entire brain in the adult. And the adult brain, has 86 billion neurons, 69 billion of them in the cerebellum, and another 86 billion or so glial cells, which, used to be thought of as sort of support cells for the neurons, which were the main cells that were information processing cells, etc. But now we know that glial cells also have very significant roles in, brain health and even information processing. So there's a lot of interest now in studying the roles of these, what used to be sort of dismissed as support cells, but glia and neurons, together comprise, this remarkable structure called the brain. The brain also has a piece right here. It's kind of like the stem of the brain, right? It's actually called the brain stem. So the brain is the cerebrum, the cerebellum, where most of your neurons are kind of crammed in, and then the brain stem, which we're going to see has a lot of very critical sort of reflexive response kinds of aspects in terms of function. And also lots and lots of cabling, passing through it so that the brain, receives sensory information from the body, and the brain can send, motor output, movement output, to the body, through this lots of cabling that run up and down the brain stem. The spinal cord also consists of, tremendous amount of cabling, of both sensory information coming from the body, up the spinal cord and to the brain. This information that's sort of heading in this ascending direction towards maps in the brain is called afferent information. Afferent information is just sensory information, like touch and pressure, etc. And then also the spinal cord has lots and lots of cabling that's heading down from the brain, and basically heading out, ultimately, from the spinal cord into the muscles of the body. This is called motor output or efferent output. So, a question is, we've got 86 billion neurons, in the, brain, largely in the brain and spinal cord. We've also got neurons and glial cells that are arrayed around the body in the periphery. And 86 billion glial cells, like 100 trillion or so synaptic connections where one neuron connects to another. Each individual neuron, right? These are really remarkable cells that we'll be, considering. Have up to 10,000 distinct connections from other neurons. One neuron they're very wire-like, you can see, and they'll carry electricity along their lengths, and then at the ends here, the terminals, there'll be a conversion process, the release of a chemical called a neurotransmitter, which can impact the activity of the next neuron, the next cell. And up to 10,000 distinct synaptic connections, are made on each of these neurons. So, we have up to like 100 trillion synaptic connections. That's an extraordinarily complex network, that makes up who you are. So where do we even begin in trying to understand how this remarkable nervous system, allows us to, feel and remember, perceive, make decisions, pay attention, speak and understand language, all these remarkable psychological processes. How does this complex nervous system do this, and how do we even begin to get a handle on psychology as a natural science, dependent on these networks of neurons? Well, one of the kind of key approaches is a structure, tells you something about function kind of an approach. So for example, like if you're interested in what's happening, in terms of what you see, it helps to actually look at the anatomy to say, okay, well, sorry, the cerebellum's going to fall. The eyeballs are, here. This is clearly where the information is, arriving. And then you can follow back, and you can see there are these little wire-like clumps here that are heading in, to, the structures in the middle of the brain here. And then you can sort of follow those cells after they make a synaptic connection, back, and you'll see at the back of the cerebrum, you're going to find, an area that's, very critically involved with the mapping, of visual inputs. And then you'll see connections out to other regions of the brain, into, this big chunk of tissue up here that we'll see is really critically important for knowing where you are actually in space and where your body is localized in space in relationship to other, objects and events that you can sort of perceive visually. And then another great big stream of information is heading into the temporal lobes. These chunks of, cerebrum that are found, right down here below this big gap here, which is called the lateral fissure. So you've got, this whole area is also receiving information that originally derived from input through your eyes. And it's really critically involved, we'll see, in recognizing, who are you talking to? What is this object? Basically recognizing different classes and, categories of object. So, by actually examining the structure, I can tell you something about, the function. Another great kind of source of insight, not great for the individuals who experienced it, but what, neuroscientists and neurosurgeons used to call sort of, natural, experiments, which are, a grisly way of sort of, saying if somebody has a stroke, right, or a traumatic injury and a portion of the brain is lost or damaged, well, you can see a very specific, often functional loss that's correlated with that. Now, correlation is not causation, so you need other forms of experimental investigation to sort of show that association more clearly and show a causative relationship. But a lot of that has actually been done using various kinds of imaging technologies or animal research, etc. So we now know a lot more from lesion experiments. When something is lost or damaged, what is the resulting sort of functional loss? People who have damage, for example, to the frontal lobes, tend to have a great deal of difficulty with social decision making, with inhibiting sort of inappropriate behavior. If the damage is on the left side in a particular area that's around near regions that send efferent or motor output to the larynx and the pharynx and the mouth, they can often have significant speech expression problems or signing expression issues, any form of language expression. So we'll talk about that later when we talk about language. So structure and function is a very good way to kind of get a sense of what's going on. And actually, if you look at the brain or the nervous system structurally, anatomically, you can actually then often say something by virtue of the structural positioning or location about what the function likely is. So for example, the central nervous system is the brain. Remember, the cerebrum and the cerebellum, where most of your neurons are located, and the brain stem, and the spinal cord. And outside of the central nervous system, or it's often abbreviated as the CNS, is the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. And that consists of nerves, both afferent, sensory information coming into the spinal cord, and also efferent, motor output, coming from the brainstem and spinal cord to, basically move your body and, engage in actual, movement behavior, right? Well, by virtue of their locations, for example, the brain is largely critically important for higher cognitive functions that we're often quite interested in the field of psychology. Things like social decision making, or visual perception, or attention, or memory. These are the regions that seem to be rather critically involved. The networks that have networks of linked neurons, synaptically linked neurons, that are found in the cerebrum or in the brain. While the spinal cord, by virtue of its positioning, its structural positioning between the brain and the peripheral nervous system in the body, right, is critically important for the transfer of information, between body and the central nervous system. So, afferent input is going to be, ascending up that spinal cord, and efferent, output is going to be descending, down that spinal cord. Also, for very rapid sort of reflexive responses, circuits, that are at the local level in the spinal cord, involving afferent or sensory input and, connections to direct sort of motor output from the cord are going to be involved in, for example, withdrawing your hand rapidly from an injury, for example. Just by virtue of its location, you get a sense of what, these different regions will likely be doing. Now,